All right, so I'm going to go ahead and, of course, I'm going to lecture a little bit, of course, about, Mesopotamia. I'm not sure how far I'm going to get today. I'll probably get more than halfway through talking about ancient Mesopotamia. Of course, I have a PowerPoint slide, which has been posted, of course. It's either in that announcement about the lecture, or you can also find it in modules as well. Probably going to blow it up like that so you can see it better a little bit. And the term ancient, we've talked about ancient Mesopotamia already. You remember if you watched the first lecture, of course, on prehistory, I went into and I talked about the 4 river valley civilizations. I told you that the oldest one was Mesopotamia, which is based, of course, in Iraq, where it's at. Modern Iraq, today is where most of it is. And the term Mesopotamia is an ancient name. It's actually a Greek name that went back, I forget exactly, but it's close to 2,000 years ago is when the Greeks coined it. And the name Mesopotamia supposedly means land between the rivers. And of course, they're talking about the 2 rivers, which we've talked about already before, which is the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, which really start up in Turkey and Syria and drain down through Iraq and into where Kuwait is in the Persian Gulf. The term Aryan, by the way, the term Mesopotamia was coined by a writer named Arrian. I think I've got a picture to show you Mesopotamia where it is. But Arrian was the Greek writer that wrote about Alexander the Great and his conquests. And Arrian was kind of trying to differentiate the region of where Iraq is, I guess, where the rest of the world was to the west. And so he kind of came up with this term, which was land between the rivers, Mesopotamia. And so he's talking about that area that's in that red area you're looking at, where you got the Tigris, Euphrates rivers, which are side by side. And you can see that Iraq is about between Iran, which is over here, and then you got Jordan and Syria over here. So it's kind of sandwiched between there and above the Persian Gulf. Also, the term cradle of civilization, that's a term that they use a lot to describe Mesopotamia. The reason why is because the belief is that that's where the first civilization started. Like the video talked about the Sumerians and all these other peoples that were there. Those are believed to be the first advanced cultures that really came about at that time. Another popular term is Fertile Crescent. A lot of historians will, use that term as well to describe the region of Mesopotamia. It was actually coined by this archaeologist named James Henry Breasted about 100 years ago or so. He was at the University of Chicago. I think he was a historian too. And he wrote a lot about that area. And he called it Fertile Crescent because it was believed to be an area like a fertile valley areas where you had all these great civilizations that were there. You got the Tigris River, you got the Euphrates River, you got the Jordan River. They also include the Nile River as well. So all 4 of those are kind of rivers that are part of the so-called Fertile Crescent. Actually goes further down, like to where the Nile is down here. But you got all these different people there. You got, like in Canaan, you got the Israelites, and you got the Phoenicians. You've got Syrians in the north, in Iraq, northern Iraq. You got Akkad in the middle there, in central Iraq. Babylonia, Sumer, those areas are also considered where a lot of famous cultures were, with the Sumerians being one of the oldest. They also have the Chaldeans. You see the Chaldeans on the bottom, Chaldea, the Persian Gulf. They're also people that are in that same region. So these are all different cultures and civilizations that will eventually emerge in Mesopotamia at one point. Now, another thing about Mesopotamia they talk about, I'll get to the term Iraq, where it comes from. Iraq becomes a popular name for Mesopotamia in the 20th century. I think I might skip that till later to explain like where it came from when I talk about the Sumerians. But one thing about Mesopotamia, which is very famous, it is associated a lot with a lot of biblical stories, especially in the book of Genesis, which is the first book in the Old Testament. And I got four of them on there on the screen you can look at that are really the most famous that they think are somehow connected to ancient Mesopotamia. You got the Garden of Eden. That's the first one. First one in the Bible, Adam and Eve. And it's believed that original stories about the Garden of Eden originated in that region, like around the Persian Gulf area. I think there's even a theory that maybe Eden was close to where like some of the islands that exist like throughout the Persian Gulf. So that's been, I think there's even a name that I think the Sumerians called Eden. They called it Dilmun, which is spelled Dilmun, Dilmun. That's the original name they called it. And over time, it kind of evolved. And I guess the Israelites took it and developed it into their own story, the Garden of Eden. The flood story, like the story of Noah, Noah's Ark and all that, is a story that's quite common as well to ancient Mesopotamia. And a lot of different civilizations in Mesopotamia write a lot about an idea of a great flood that occurred. And it may have. Like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's stories about a great flood where someone builds an ark as well. Tower of Babel, which is supposed to happen after the Great Flood. Tower of Babel, that was where supposedly in Genesis, there was a story where humans began building this great tower towards God in heaven. And God got angry and made all the workers speak different languages so that it wouldn't be complete. And some believe the Tower of Babel was built where Babylon is in southern Iraq today, which maybe the bottom over the part ruins of it might still exist, they think, because some theories think it may have been built multiple times at one point. So yeah, the Tower of Babel is a very famous story, well known. Then Abraham also, I wanted to mention him too. Abraham is also connected to Mesopotamia because it's believed that he originated from southern Iraq, where the Sumerian city of Ur is spelled U-R, Ur. So they think over time that Abraham and his wife Sarah migrated westward into Canaan. And so he might be somehow related to some of those Mesopotamian peoples that lived there. So there's kind of a debate about how he's related, and all that to the Hebrews later. So that's basically, kind of some of the background on that, how the Bible's kind of associated with the region. I don't think I know about that one there. There's a part in the slide where it talks about Mesopotamia as a crossroad of civilizations. Kind of is, because Mesopotamia, if you look at that map, I've got two maps of the Mesopotamian region that I can show you. But you got this one and you got that one. I think this one's probably a better one to use. But Mesopotamia is kind of like in the middle of like a lot of trade routes that run through from Asia to Africa, Asia into Turkey, Western Turkey. And so you've got a lot of people converging on that fertile valleys, which are right there. And so you got Africa to the southwest, Asia to the east, and then Europe to the northwest. So a lot of people have fought over that region. There's been constant wars on Mesopotamia, not just back then in ancient times, but even up to modern times. You've seen how they've had so many wars in that area. Now, I did want to talk about one more thing on this page right here that's kind of important. Where is it? Right here. Also, in Mesopotamia, there are different kinds of people that dominated that region. You had one group, of course, which was what they call Semitic people that really dominate Mesopotamia up to about the 6th century BC. So these would be peoples like you see there, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, Phoenicians, Israelites. Those are all considered to be mostly Semitic type peoples of that region. And most of them live around the southwestern part of Asia. That's where most of your Semitic people came from that, and maybe part of North Africa as well. And they all kind of spoke a similar kind of language. And later, a lot of their language, if you know about it, was predominantly written down, eventually right to left, with Arabic, like the Arabs too. You can throw the Arabs and Jews, which I guess are descendants of the Israelites. Yeah, the Arabs and the Jews, they all write languages that are written right to left, which is Arabic and Hebrew, as an example. Phoenician was also written right to left too, which was a Semitic language as well. So yeah, that one group there, you have like Semitic people that were traditionally more dominant in Iraq up to about the 6th century BC. Then they have another group too that was also, it came in later, it dominated to that region. You have Indo-Aryan or Indo-Europeans. It's kind of like the same people or kind of related to each other. These are what they call Caucasian peoples that eventually inhabit parts of Asia and Europe. And it's believed that the Aryan peoples, as they call them for short, originated from somewhere in southern Russia, close to where the Caspian and Black Sea areas are. So in that area, you've heard of the Caucasus Mountains, which are near the Black Sea. That's about right in that area, but also close to the Caspian Sea. And the Aryans eventually migrated into parts of Europe, in parts of Asia, predominantly. And in Iran, they had what they call the Persians, who dominated there as a culture. And they would later go on and develop the Persian Empire. And then in Turkey, they had the Hittites. The Hittites would later develop the Hittite Empire, which I'll get to later about that. Also, other people like, the Greeks, Romans later are considered what we call, Indo-European type peoples and so on. And a lot of their languages later are mostly written left to right. So most Indo-European languages usually go in that order, although Persian is actually written right to left because of influence from Arabic. Right, so let me go ahead and move on. Of course, let's kind of talk about that stuff on that page. Let me move on to talk about the, of course, Sumerian culture, which comes in next. That's one of the main things we'll talk about today is that culture. Sumerians, of course, was the first civilization that developed in Mesopotamia. So they're like the oldest civilization in Mesopotamia. They date back over 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. So they're pretty old civilization. And so that's part of why Mesopotamia is the cradle of civilization because of this culture. I think they think, like it says in there, it might be the first civilization in the world. I think some people even actually think that more or less about the Sumerians. And they settled in an area that's called Sumer, Sumer, which is a name that other people called it, like the Akkadians and others I talked about, give it that nickname. This is an area that's located, I'll show you on a map, that's in like southern Iraq or southeastern Iraq, roughly, which is right here. They began to develop numerous cities there, which were mostly city-states that were mostly agricultural based. They mostly developed farming and culture, all that. So yeah, Sumer might be the first civilization. It says 3000 BC, but the date on it varies from 3 to 4000 BC. And they don't really know much about the origins of the Sumerians. I think some theorize they came out of Asia somewhere, maybe in a mountainous area, they think, and migrated into the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. And like I said, they had famous agricultural city-states, like I talked about. With those three, really, I guess, are considered some of the most famous city-states that they were known for. Eridu, of course, they say might be one of the oldest. That dates back 5,000 years ago. They always talk about Jericho being pretty old, but Eridu might be considered to be the first ancient city of the Bronze Age that you have. So it's like 5,000 BC, 3,000 BC. It might be when it was founded, I know, but it's over close to 5,000 years old. And then you have Ur. You see the next one, number 2 there. Ur. That one's famous because of Abraham. And then also it was considered like the last stronghold of the Sumerians, and we'll get to it later. It's famous for having its great ziggurat of Ur. That's been rebuilt there. That's that kind of survived in that time. Then the third one, which is pronounced Iraq, like the country, Iraq, of course, is the most famous in the end. That one was the largest city of the different city states, and it's also where the namesake of the nation of Iraq comes from. It was kind of borrowed from that city's name, and the reason why was because Iraq was supposedly the city-state that King Gilgamesh ruled from. He was one of the first famous, I guess, famous kings of Mesopotamia you hear about. That they wrote epic stories about and all of that. So kind of talking about how they developed agriculture, and most of the kind of crops they grew were like barley, wheat, and of course date palm, things like that were the kind of crops they had, and so on. Probably sesame, as well. Of course, the big thing that the Sumerians are known for are all their technologies. Of course, the video talked about cuneiform. That really is the most famous invention that the Sumerians came up with. And of course, cuneiform is a type of Sumerian language system that was developed by a lot of different cultures in Mesopotamia. It was used for a writing system by everybody. And of course, it was a type of writing system that was written on clay tablets. They didn't have paper yet and all that. And so they would take wet clay tablets. They would use like a stylus. They would make indentions in it. And the word cuneiform, it means wedge-shaped because of the fact that when they would make their mark, you would have a wedge or triangular shape to the actual you can kind of see behind me. I think it's kind of a cuneiform tablet. It's kind of in that picture. And I'll show you some more that I've got as well. And the term cuneiform is a modern term. It was actually developed in the 18th century, I think, by some British historians or whatever. And so that's where the name originated from. Yeah, I've got some pictures. Of course, here's a picture how they think it evolved. They think that cuneiform evolved from the idea of like what they call a pictogram or something, or ideograms, where they took like pictures or objects or ideas, they made them into like an alphabet, and so on, syllables, etc. And so they would make their mark, you see, on these cuneiform tablets, and then they would take them out, and I guess to dry them in the sun. If in Iraq, it can get like 120, 130 degrees out there, pretty hot, and just bake them pretty much. They have found, by the way, thousands of cuneiform tablets. I think it's the number, but I've seen anywhere from 500,000 to maybe 1 million or so have been found at one point, probably since like the 19th century. And but the only thing about it, only a small percentage have actually been translated. Like maybe 10 to 20% of it's been translated, I think. So there's very few people that can actually read cuneiform. So cuneiform is something that's kind of a rare field. All that. Now, of course, one thing that's very famous, of course, about the Sumerians is the Epic of Gilgamesh, of course, which is a famous Sumerian epic poem that dates to about the 21st century. That's what it dates back to. They think it may have been oral originally, then written down over time. And it tells the story of the king of Iraq, Gilgamesh, who goes on a bunch of adventures. He's one of the most famous kings on the list of Sumerian kings. And there's different versions of it. Like I think the Akkadians have their own version of it, which is called Atrahasis, that they have as well, that's well known. And one of the stories they tell about is that, well, there's a couple stories I guess I'll kind of mention about interesting. There's one story where he goes on a quest for immortality, where one of his friends dies. I think Enkidu, I think his name was. And he sought this plant that if he ate it, would make him immortal. Of course, in the story, he ends up failing to find it, like his quest, more or less. There's another story where he finds this wise man that he meets, who his name was Ut-Napishtim. They basically call him the Sumerian Noah, was the name. And anyway, apparently, the story is very similar to like the flood story in the book of Genesis. There's very similar stories to it. And I think the guy told him how he built this ark because there was a great flood coming to save all the people and animals and all that. And so there's a lot of parallel stories with like the Genesis story of the flood and all that. I thought I had two of them on that, didn't I? Oh, there it is right there, the Epic of Gilgamesh. So yeah, it's very similar to that legend, of course. I think even like the amount of days and, the time it like rained and all that, and the amount that, that it all flooded and all that was kind of similar, a similar matter. All right, let me see what else I need to cover. Also, let me go back up here. I didn't talk about all the different technologies that the Sumerians were also known for. I've got a few things that they kind of invented. I'll kind of put up on the screen for you. So the wheel. I think they may have been one of the first to use the wheel a lot overall. And I think the wheel led to things like the cart and the chariot, which follow after that. So they definitely don't things like that. Composite bow may have been something else. They think they developed some kind of bow and arrow. No, they start using at that time. A sailboat was something that they supposedly invented. Beer. You don't think much about that, but that is one thing that they are known for, developing the first kind of alcoholic type beer. It was mostly made from like barley, like sweetened barley juice, I guess, made, with fermented water. Of course, they didn't have like hops and stuff like that. They added into it, so it's more like a kind of a malt liquor kind of beer. It's kind of what they made. The bronze plow, they also developed that. I saw in the video they have a calendar system which had like about 12 months in it roughly. They knew about time, like they knew about the hour, they knew about the minute. So they knew about all kinds of things, of course, like that. They had organized religion. Like a lot of their cities had usually these temple towers or temples called ziggurats that were like kind of like temples mostly. And so the high priests or whatever priests they had were pretty dominant as a central part of their culture and all that. And that's the one thing we need to talk about next, which is the so-called ziggurat. I need to get into that because that's really one of the most famous things that the Sumerians are really known for is the ziggurat. And these are like these, they're really like step pyramids, more or less, like made of mud brick. But people sometimes call them different names like temple towers or something like that they'll call it. And they're called that because sometimes they're kind of like a step pyramid type temple, and then sometimes more like a cylinder type tower. So they were built in different variations, more or less. They built pretty much these ziggurats from the time of like the Sumerians all the way down to the time of King Nebuchadnezzar, who reigned over the later New Babylonian Empire. I'll go through and give you some examples of some of these ziggurats. Of course, one you see there on the screen is the Tower of Babel, which it's sometimes called Entemenanki. Entemenanki was supposedly this great ziggurat that was built by, they think, maybe in what is now Babylonia or southern Iraq. I forget how tall I thought it was, but they thought it was like really tall, like 8,000 feet tall, which is, kind of ridiculous. That's actually what they thought it was. But I think some people think it was maybe a few hundred feet tall, maybe really is what it really was. Some people claimed it was like taller than skyscrapers or something like that. And it was built multiple times. I know in the Bible there was Nimrod that built it. He was like a great grandson of Noah. And then they also think that King Nebuchadnezzar, or one of those kings, may have built one similar to it later, like a ziggurat, which may have been one of the tallest, they think. So I think maybe it may have been 300 feet tall, but they're not sure about that. Then they have one that's the one that they've got now that's been kind of rebuilt, that's well known today. That's, by the way, what they look like. They think the Sumerian ziggurats, but they have the Great Ziggurat of Ur, which was built about 4,000 years ago, close to about the 20th or 21st century BC is when it was constructed. That one was actually rediscovered by a man named Sir Leonard Woolley. I think there was a picture I thought I saw up here. Where does it go? They were showing a picture of Woolley here doing some excavations. There he is. He lived from 1880 to 1960. And Woolley was a British archaeologist. He's actually kind of like what they call a biblical archaeologist, because I believe Woolley was one of these guys that tried to use the Bible to find historical sites that the Bible talks about and all that. Like Ur, was one of the things he went and searched for and found it, they think. That happened like in the 1920s when Woolley went to Iraq and all that. And so he found that ziggurat. It was one of the things he found first. And he began to excavate it. And when he dug down into it, you know what he found? He found like some tombs in it that were buried inside of it, Sumerian tombs. So ziggurats were not just like a temple. They were built as tombs, and also the king used it as like a civic center to run the government and all that. So it was really a bunch of things, these temple tower ziggurat structures. Here's another picture, of course, of the ziggurat. Also, the staircases and all that were added on later. So like a lot of the facade on the outside was eventually built more into the later part of the 20th century. And that was done actually by President Saddam Hussein, who was president of Iraq, at that time. And Saddam, by the way, is very famous for putting a lot of money into ancient antiquities of Iraq, from Mesopotamia. And so he's done a lot to kind of revitalize a lot of these archaeological sites. I think Babylon's been another area that he worked a lot to try to restore, more or less, Iraq. So they always talk about the evil stuff he was as a dictator, but historically he did a lot of great things, archaeologically, people don't really talk much about. Also, they claim that also that let me put this off here, but they believe that Woolley supposedly found part of the house of Abraham, where Abraham lived. They've actually rebuilt that too. It's actually been rebuilt, I think, more in modern times. I think Saddam started doing that too, rebuilding that as well. But that's the so-called house of Abraham. So yeah, maybe that may have been where Abraham lived, but they're not sure. It's kind of debated today about that. So I'm talking about all these archaeological sites that they're kind of known for. One more thing I will show you, which I'll talk about later. They also believe that another famous ziggurat, of course, was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which, of course, were built in the 6th century BC. It was built by King Nebuchadnezzar, who was one of the greatest kings of the New or Neo-Babylonian Empire. And this ziggurat, if you know much about it, was considered one of the great 7 wonders of the world by the ancient Greeks. And he supposedly built it for his wife. It's kind of like her own palace, like to live in. And it was known for having a lot of tropical like trees and mechanical waterfalls on it that would fall down from the top. And it was actually around till Alexander the Great's time, which was around the 4th century BC. Alexander actually tried to have it rebuilt because it was falling apart, but earthquakes destroyed it eventually. So I forget how tall they think it was, but they thought it was like maybe around 200 feet tall or more. We're not really sure about that, but supposedly the bottom of it still exists. So they do think it was a real structure. But the Bible doesn't talk about that one. It talks about like the Tower of Babel and stuff like that, but not those. All right, let me move on to one more thing about the Sumerians real quick. Let me also talk about, let me move back up here and talk about religion real quick. I need to get into that. Now, the Sumerians had a lot of gods, which I think it was like in the hundreds overall. But they did have some chief gods I did want to talk about real quick. They were pretty big. The three chief gods they had were Anu, Enki, and Enlil. Those ones they always talk about the most. They went back the furthest a long time ago. They were called different names. Like Anu was originally called An, but the Akkadians called him Anu. Enki was sometimes called Ea or Ea. I think they say it that way. And Enlil was just Enlil they had. Anu was considered the highest god. So like the father of the gods. If you want to compare him to other gods, the best way to do it would be to compare Anu to the Greek god Zeus or Jupiter, the Roman Jupiter. And a lot of the Greeks thought that. When the Greeks came into the Middle East, Iraq, they thought it was the same thing. And so it's kind of like the equivalent. Anu is associated with the sky, heavens, of course. And he's got two sons, you see, Enki and Enlil. Enki was mostly a god, predominantly of wisdom and water. Those two things. And he's mostly an earth god, like based on the earth. And Enlil's based in the air. And so he's often associated with like storms, bad weather, dust, desert storms and things like that. And so he's often called the air or wind god. So it's like Anu's the sky, Enki's the water, and Enlil's the air. It's interesting how that must have been like the Sumerian three elements. Kind of a joke. They also had Marduk or Marduk. I think they say it different ways. Marduk was, of course, the son of Enki. He was also a very popular god later, especially when you get down to Assyrian Babylonian times. He becomes a pretty big god overall. He was the god of water and magic that they had. So he eventually replaces those other gods as being more important over time. So, but they had all kinds of gods. They had gods for everything. But gods for the moon. They had gods for the sun. They had gods for fertility. They even had a beer goddess. I think her name was Ninkasi, the beer goddess. Crazy stuff the Sumerians had. So, now, what happened in the Sumerian culture? They peaked around about 2000 BC or so, and they got conquered by other people. So other people would come in later, mostly the Akkadian culture. The Akkadians would kind of merge with them, and they would form like one people that was sometimes called Akkadian Sumerian. So those two would kind of merge. But the Sumerians, the Akkadians were like Semitic Sumerians, and they were not sure what their background was. So it's kind of a mystery. They don't know if they're, Semitic or maybe Indo-Aryans or whatever. They have no idea about that one. So let me go ahead and move on. Of course, we'll finish up the Sumerians. Let me go ahead and what I got next here to cover. Where was I? Right here. I was talking about, of course, I need to get into talk about the Akkadians a little bit today, maybe just for a few minutes and talk about them a little bit. The Akkadians were around just for a short time, for a couple hundred years. Who are the Akkadians? I could put some on the screen for you. Of course, they were a Semitic people of Mesopotamia. And they originated from a city-state and city that the video kind of mentioned a little bit about, which is called Akkad. The city doesn't exist anymore. It's now, I don't know if you know where the ruins are. I think it's totally destroyed, Akkad, but it's believed to be originally located in central Iraq. And what happened was over time, this city-state emerged to conquer all of Iraq, and it became an empire that a lot of people call now the Akkadian Empire, which you can see was only around for a short time, the 24th to the 22nd centuries BC. So it's a very short-lived empire. Actually, Akkadians are still around. we have Akkadian Semitic people that still exist, like in the Middle East, but they're just a remnant of the former empire from a long time ago. They did have a founder. I think I might have a picture of Sargon. I don't know, but yeah, I do. Here it is right here. There's a picture of Sargon the Great, which you can see there. Sargon, of course, was the founder of the Akkadian Empire. And it's the debate about when he lived. They think he lived either in the 24th or 23rd century, kind of around that time period. It's about 2300 BC, circa or about. It's about when he lived. And it's believed that Sargon conquered a majority of that territory you're looking at. That's all in that pinkish, reddish color there on the map. And his empire would go on to control multiple areas or multiple states that were combined into one empire. So yeah, the Akkadian Empire was considered to be one of the first multinational empires. So they controlled like parts of where the Sumerians were, Akkad, also controlled parts of the north, where Assyria will be, and all that. There's not much known about him. It's mostly archaeology and all that, but that statue that you're looking at, of course, is considered one of the first statues of any kind of Mesopotamian ruler from ancient times. So basically, yeah, that's basically when they lived and all of that. Let me get that in a second. But one more slide I will share you with as well. What's going to happen later? Like I said, the Akkadian Empire is a very short-lived empire. It would collapse, of course, sometime they think in the 22nd century. And what happens is Mesopotamia splits in half. The northern part of Mesopotamia, or northern Iraq and part of Syria, becomes known as Assyria. See where it says Taurus Mountains and Nineveh, all that up there in the north? All that area becomes what they call Assyria. And then the area in the south, like the southern part of Iraq or Mesopotamia, becomes what they call Babylonia. And so over time, you're going to have this separation where two states will eventually emerge from there. In the north, you're going to have the Assyrian Empire. In the south, you're going to have the Babylonian Empire, which are actually two of them that existed there. Let me go ahead and review real quick, of course, all the material I've covered so far, and then I will continue more, of course, lecturing, of course, on this period. We've got plenty of time left. What does the term Mesopotamia mean in Greek? What two main rivers are located in Iraq? The term means the land between the rivers, which I told you was coined by Arian. And the two rivers, of course, are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Why are other terms used for Iraq, such as Fertile Crescent? Fertile Crescent was a term I told you that was coined by James Henry Breasted. He was an American archaeologist. He was describing all the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt, where all these different civilizations developed. Cradle of civilizations is a term they use or a nickname for the fact that Mesopotamia was the birthplace of where they had the first civilizations, like the Sumerians, of course. What biblical story is associated with Mesopotamian region? I told you about the Garden of Eden story. You've got the flood story. You've got the Tower of Babel. You've got also the story of Abraham in Genesis as well. What are examples of Semitic civilization, peoples that lived throughout the Mesopotamian region? These were people that were in the southwestern part of Asia mostly. These were people like Phoenicians, Israelites, later the Jews, the Arabs, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans. Which Indo-European civilization lived in Turkey and Iran? Turkey, you had the Hittite Empire. Iran, you had the Persians and the Persian Empire. They're also called Indo-Aryan, like the ones in Iran. Who were the Sumerians? Where was the land of Sumer? The Sumerians were the first civilization to settle and develop Mesopotamia or Iraq. They lived in the land of Sumer, which was located in southern Iraq, was where it was. Sumerians were famous for different city-states. The three I gave you the most that were the most famous were Eridu, the oldest, Ur, which is in the Bible, mentioned because of Abraham, and then Iraq, spelled U-R-U-K, of course. It's the most famous because of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and of course the name of Iraq today. What was cuneiform? How did one write cuneiform? Cuneiform was a Sumerian-type writing language system that was written on cuneiform tablets, and they used like a stylus to write symbols, of course, in wet clay. They didn't use paper and all that yet. What does cuneiform mean? It means in Latin, wedge-shaped. What was the Epic of Gilgamesh? It was a famous Sumerian epic that dated back to about the 21st century originally, BC. And it's a story. It's basically an epic story about the king of Iraq, who's called King Gilgamesh. What famous disaster was mentioned, which is similar to the Genesis story in the Old Testament, the flood story of Noah and his ark. So there's very similarities. There's actually a story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is parallel, to the flood story. What are some technology innovations Sumerians were famous for? I told you all kinds of things. Bronze, the wheel, chariot, probably cart, sailboat, beer, the plow. They had a calendar system, time. So those are all kinds of things. They say the Sumerians invented almost everything that people have later just about that I've talked about. Of course, ziggurats, organized religion, kind of went hand in hand, as well as ziggurats, of course, were these Sumerian or Mesopotamian step pyramids or temple towers, whatever you want to call them, that were made from mud brick. And these were built from the time of the Sumerians down to the time of King Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians. Give me examples of ziggurats that were built. Some think that the Tower of Babel may have been like an early version of a ziggurat mentioned in the Bible. They think Intimanonki, who I mentioned about, may have been a version of that built in Babylon. Maybe by Nebuchadnezzar. They're not sure about that. The Great Ziggurat of Ur was built by, of course, the Sumerians. That was the one that Sir Leonard Woolley excavated. So he was the one that discovered it. Sir Leonard Woolley, the 1920s, roughly. So Woolley. And also the third one, too, was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which I'll talk about later again. That's another ziggurat they think that was built by King Nebuchadnezzar. Who are the three main gods? What are their attributes? Of course, I talked about Anu. That was the father, chief god of the Sumerians, inhabited the sky. He had his two sons, of course, which were Enki and Enlil. Enki was more of a, I told you, like a water god associated with the wisdom and earth. And Enlil was more of a wind god associated with like the air and storms and things like that. Also, they had Marduk. I told you Marduk was a famous Babylonian god of water and magic, the son of Enki, and he was later a god that became more popular, especially by the time of the Assyrians and Babylonians. Who are the Akkadians? The Akkadians were a Semitic people that conquered Iraq. They kind of merged with the Sumerian people. And they had a famous king named Sargon the Great or Sargon the First. He's called all kinds of names. Sargon of Akkad. And he founded the first really major multinational empire in Mesopotamia, close to about 2300 BC. But it was a short-lived empire. And the bulk of the empires later, which are Babylonia and Assyria, are related back to them. So that's what I want to get to next. I've got a few minutes. I'm going to, of course, move on to talk about the Babylonian Empire next. Of course, that comes in also as well. So we've got them to get into. And it's called different names. I'll put it on the screen, but it's either called the Paleo or Old Babylonian Empire. That's actually what they call it officially. They use the kind of the Greek term sometimes with it because if you know about Babylonia, they had two empires. They had the old Babylonian Empire. That's one of King Hammurabi you may have heard of. And they had the new one, the new or Neo Babylon you see on the bottom there, which was of King Nebuchadnezzar, which was actually 1,000 years apart. So it's kind of weird about that, but that's why they give it those different names, so people won't confuse the fact that they have these two different separate empires that they had. And the empire itself, which peaked only between about 18th to about the 16th century, about 200-year period or so, it was a Semitic state that was in modern Iraq. It was composed of multiple peoples. Those two right there were the majority of the people that made up the Babylonian state. Akkadian, of course, which most people were related to, or Akkadian Sumerian, basically. And then they had another people that were called the Amorite people. And the Amorite people were a people that came out of, well, it says the east there, but it's not correct. They actually came out of what is part of Syria. That's where they originated from, the Amorites. The Amorites came into Mesopotamia, and eventually they took over and ruled the state because all of the rulers of the Babylonian Empire were Amorite as a dynasty. Now, they had 12 kings total. I'm only going to talk about one because he's really the best one they had overall. But that was, of course, their greatest king, of course, was Hammurabi. King Hammurabi, of course, who was the sixth king of the Babylonians. And Hammurabi was, of course, the founder of the Babylonian Empire, which was created, they believe, in the early 18th century. Here's kind of a map showing you, of course, the region of where about this empire was at one point. You can see on the map, it went from like part of northern Iraq and what is Syria, eastern Syria, went all the way down into southern Iraq and maybe where Kuwait was at one point. And you can see the city it was based around was, of course, called Babylon. That became like its capital overall. And the name Babylonia or Babylonian is originated from the word either Babylon or Babel, which is the Hebrew word, basically, which is a word that means confusion. I don't know if I've explained to you why that name came about, but if you remember going back to the story about the Tower of Babel, you know what Babel means, to speak in a foreign, funny tongue or whatever. Well, apparently when they were building the Tower of Babel, God made everybody speak different tongues. They say that's how different languages came about over time. And so the word Babel means confusion, because they were confused in how to build it. I think also the Israelites, when they were in captivity in Babylon or Babylonia, they were confused by the culture, which was different from theirs. The language was different and the religions were different. And so they say that's where the word originated from, Babylon, Babel, or Babylon. I'm saying Babylon or something like that also as well. So yeah, we're talking about King Hammurabi. Hammurabi, of course, the guy that founded the empire. He conquered most of the empire. And then he had a dynasty of rulers that reigned down to close to about 1600, more or less. Now, Hammurabi, if you know about it, is very famous for his law code system. That's pretty much the thing that he's famous for today. He's got his own law code system, that's named after him. It's either called the Code of Hammurabi, or of course the other name they called it is the Hammurabi Code for short. They believe it was developed in the early part of the 18th century. I think they seem to think that maybe it was developed about, I want to say, close to 1770s BC. I think that's one theory they've come up with, more or less. And Hammurabi Code is considered to be the first major written law code system that was put down in written form. They do think that law codes existed before, going back to the Sumerians. I think under a king named ur-nammu, they had a law code system called the Code of ur-nammu, which existed, but it was not as extensive as this code itself. And it wasn't written on paper. It was written on stone columns, basically. in cuneiform, like a Akkadian dialect of cuneiform. And it had 282 laws that were inscribed on it that were later eventually translated into other languages. And I've got a picture. I think I've got pictures of it. I can show you. They have only found one of them, of one of these. They call it a stele or stela, which is like a stone column that kind of stands up erect. The one they found one in 1901 in southern Iran near a city called Susa, S-U-S-A. And that one is now in the Louvre, is where it's at. You take all this so you can see that better right there. So it's got the, the laws inscribed on it. And at the top, very interesting here, it's got some kind of inscription at the top where it shows apparently one of their gods. So they think is the god, I think they seem to think it's the god Shamash, which was like a solar god and a god of justice, giving the laws to King Hammurabi. You see a statue over here on the right. So I guess the Babylonians kind of believe that the gods, their God gave them the laws, to rule over the land and so on. And if you know much about the law code systems, they ran on a specific principle, which is very famous. It's known as, well, the actual the term they use is actually lex talionis, which means law of retaliation. But in the biblical sense that they use now, the Bible mentions this too, is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And so it's the idea of equal compensation for something that you've lost. So somebody takes out your eye, the idea is that you should get some kind of equal compensation for it. It doesn't mean that they're going to take that other guy's eye out that took your eye out, but they're going to give you some kind of compensation for it, which might be money or something like a fine or whatever it is. Of course, death could mean, so you kill somebody, they put you to death too. That's a case. It's also cases where you steal something, they might put you to death, but they might cut your hand off. So it depends. A lot of it depended on like what your social status was. So people that were in like the upper class, upper social strata, or whatever, usually might get off, versus people that might be poor or even slaves. Like if you're a slave, like for a slave to strike or kill some upper class person like their master, you can imagine what would happen. That kind of deal. Let me give you examples of some of their laws. Here's the original one that they're talking about, which I believe is number 196 in the code out of 282 laws. It says, if a man knock out the teeth of his equal, his teeth shall be knocked out. So that's where that whole tooth for a tooth thing came from as well. I believe there's one for eye too, somewhere. I think eye is 196 and tooth is 200. I think that's what it is actually, the different laws. If a son strike his father, his hands shall be cut off. Ooh. If anyone is committing a robbery and is caught, they shall be put to death. The son of a prostitute, crazy. Yeah, if a son of a prostitute says to his mother, "You are not my mother," his tongue shall be cut off. Wow. If a man strike a freeborn woman so that she lose her unborn child, he shall pay 10 shekels for her loss. So you have to pay a fine as you killed her unborn baby. So wow. If a slave says to his master, "You are not my master," they convict him, his master shall cut off his ear. So anyway, just kind of talking about some of these laws that existed under the Hammurabi Code. And the code is important because, it created the idea of equal justice, throughout his kingdom, his empire, and it promoted order and justice, things like that, which is, one of the first to really do that as a civilization, more or less. They actually say that women had actually pretty good rights under the Hammurabi Code. They can even divorce their husband if they want to as well. Although if a woman committed adultery, she was usually put to death, though, like that. All right, now what happened to the Babylonians? Well, they lasted as a culture to about 1600 BC, and then what happened was they were sacked and destroyed by the Hittites. Hittites came in. I told you about them already. They were a type of Indo-European people that were in what is modern Turkey. Here's some examples if you want to look at later of the Hammurabi Code, which is right here. But yeah, they mostly are conquered by the Hittites and other groups that they also the Kassites too. The Kassites, yeah, they came in too as well and sacked them as well. But the Hittites sacked them first, as far as they know, close to about 1600 BC. And I'll kind of go through and talk about the Hittites a little bit, and I might have time to talk about maybe one more thing after that as well. And they think the Hittites who settled in Turkey, which they called a long time ago in ancient times Anatolia, didn't originate from Turkey. They weren't from Turkey originally. They didn't come from there. They think they came from parts of Eastern Europe. So they're part of these waves of, I told you, Indo-European peoples that kind of spread all over Europe and Asia. And they think the Hittites, who were called originally the Hatti, that's what they called themselves, Hatti. Hittite is a biblical term. They came from the southern Ukraine, which would be like right above the Black Sea. So you have the Black Sea, you can see in that picture. So somewhere north of that, they think, is where the Hittites came from. And then what happened was sometime about probably over 3,500 years ago or more, they migrated around the Black Sea and they ended up in Turkey, roughly. And you can see their capital right there. I don't know if you see it or not, but it's kind of in the middle there. Tusa or Tusas. It's called either one, I think, how they spelled it. Tusas, something like that. And that was their capital. And the peak of the Hittite rule was was an empire they had called the Neo-Hittite or New Hittite state or empire. They call it different names. And this empire controlled most of Turkey. It controlled parts of Syria. And it also controlled parts of northern Iraq or Mesopotamia. So it's a pretty big empire. Hittites, were a rival state to actually the Egyptians. The Egyptians and the Hittites didn't like each other too much. And both of them fought for control over like Syria, like up in this area. Like the Egyptians coming up the coast here under Ramses the Great. I'll get to later. And he comes into conflict with the Hittites, who are basically in control right here. The Hittites, by the way, were the first major civilization to experiment with making iron-type tools and weapons. So they figured out how to smelt iron, and all that. You know what they figured out that's interesting about? They figured out that they could take iron or iron ore and melt it down and make, implements out of it. What they figured out, I don't know how they did it, but they figured out that it had to be a really high temperature. I think to actually melt iron or iron ore, you have to heat it up to a temperature of 2,795 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a lot. That's pretty hot. Makes you wonder how the World Trade Center fell because of that. It's got to be that hot. 2,800 degrees. That's pretty hot. I don't know how they figured that out, but they did, smelting it. And one thing about, the Hittites influenced the beginning of the Iron Age. The Iron Age started afterwards, maybe close to about 1200 BC. And then iron from there spread throughout the world at that point. But the Hittites were not around very long. Like the Neo or New Hittite Empire lasted about maybe close to about 1200 or early 12th century. And then what happened was, if you know about the Hittites, they got wiped out by this mysterious people that attacked the Mediterranean Sea, which are called the Sea Peoples. here's more about of course, the Hittites, which are right here. But yeah, the Sea Peoples were a type of, they're kind of some kind of confederacy of seafaring raiders that were armed with iron weapons. So they're Iron Age people. And they attacked the Mediterranean Sea. They attacked like Turkey, Cyprus. They attacked Egypt and parts of like where Syria and the Levant is. And it pretty much killed off the Hittite Empire. Hittite Empire pretty much by pretty much I think mid 12th century had been wiped out. In fact, Atusa, I told you about, their capital, was burned to the ground by them. They destroyed them basically. So it's very interesting. These people that came in and it of course caused what they call the late Bronze Age collapse, which you may have heard about, where all these different cultures collapsed. Like you may have heard of the Minoans and Mycenaeans collapsed at the time. Egypt began declining. Hittites collapsed as a culture as the Iron Age kind of came in at that point. And there's a lot of theories and mysteries about the Sea Peoples. They don't know who they are. They've pushed all kinds of theories about who the Sea Peoples are. Some people think that the Sea Peoples were the Greeks that came in. Like you hear stories about the Hellenes or Greek peoples that take over Greece, like the Dorians and the Ionian Greeks. Maybe could have been them. Some people have pushed the Philistines, who settle where Israel is, as another group that it could have been as well. It could have been the Minoans and Mycenaeans. I don't know about that, because the Minoans and Mycenaeans were Bronze Age culture and not Iron Age. So I don't know about that either about that. I'm not sure what Herodotus says. I have to check Herodotus. I think Herodotus may have had a theory too about it, but the Egyptians wrote mostly about him. They wrote about the Sea Peoples, and what they said about them was that they were non-Semitic, which is interesting about that. And so Greeks or Philistines could be either one, because they think that both those were non-Semitic cultures, or more or less. But that's what happened with Hittites. They basically got wiped out. So yeah, that's maybe the map maybe of where they came from. So yeah, the Greeks, you got the so-called Dorian Ionian invasion of the Greeks, the Hellenes they call them also, which may have come out of this region. So it's possible that they might be related, but they really don't know for sure. Of course, I will be talking more about the Assyrian culture as well. I don't know if I'm going to get to that today or not, of the Assyrians. I don't know if we really can wait on that if you want about that. But next, who's going to get in control, of course, of Mesopotamia is going to be the Assyrian culture that's going to come in. And this is, of course, a Semitic type state and people that will emerge in northern Iraq, in Assyria. They're based not on the Euphrates, like, the one of Hammurabi was. Hammurabi was like Euphrates River, that kingdom. Their empire and state is based along the Tigris River, especially the upper part of the Tigris River in northern Iraq, in Assyria. And maybe talk a few things about it, and then I'll probably quit. But this was actually a state that started as a city-state that was called Ashur. It's actually pronounced Ashur. They say, or actually either pronounced Ashur or Assur, because it's a debate about how they say the name. It's either pronounced Ashurian or they say Assyrian. So I think I had a friend of mine that's from Syria. That's where the name came from, I guess. He says it's pronounced Ashurian. So it's kind of a debate about how they actually say it. But they do think that this culture emerged, the city-state, and they think the name came from a god that they worship that was the same name, the god Ashur, or Assur, which was some kind of Assyrian war god that they worship. So the name of the city and the religion of their main god was apparently linked as the same thing. I'm not sure which the city's named after. When they say Assyria, whatever, they're talking about, the people of Assur, the city, or the god, or is it both? Oh, another guy I'll mention real quick about was Ishtar. Ishtar is a very popular god too, later with the Assyrians and also with the Babylonians, like of Nebuchadnezzar. And that was a famous fertility goddess. It was real popular with women in the Mesopotamian world. And they think Ishtar is some kind of version of Inanna that was a Sumerian goddess of similar kind of equivalency. Ishtar is interesting because Ishtar is, like they say, the goddess that they think influenced like Aphrodite of the Greeks, Romans, like Venus, and maybe Isis, the Egyptian goddess you've heard of, that's similar, which is a fertility goddess too of them. So it's interesting about them. But I'll talk more about the Assyrians later. I think we'll stop here for today. That's good enough. About an hour and 15 minutes. It's about probably good enough for today, lecture-wise today. But what I'll do is on Friday, I'm going to, of course, wrap up Mesopotamia is what I'll do. I'm going to wrap up Mesopotamia, and then I will review a little bit the rest of the stuff we did from Mesopotamia, and then I will move on to talk about ancient Egypt. So we'll talk about that next, because I think next week, probably part of, I want to say Friday, Monday, and I don't know, maybe into Wednesday next week too as well, I'll probably be covering on ancient Egypt. So the length of these lectures will vary. It pretty much anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half. Just depends on how much information that we need to cover for each day. Because, this is a 7 weeks class. So a lot of stuff is kind of compressed, into a very short period of time. So before I go, don't forget, about various assignments that you've got posted right now. Don't forget, you need to finish the pre-test this week. So get that done by Friday. And the prehistory quiz, that's, of course, up till Monday about. So try to get that done as well. Try to keep up with the lectures. I know most of you aren't watching this live because I'm recording it to upload it later. But I am, like I said, post this to my YouTube channel afterwards. So be familiar with my YouTube channel. There's a playlist for all the lectures I will be posting there, of course, every week. And so that's it for today. Hope y'all are doing well out there and keeping safe, I guess, and so on. I think hopefully we got these hurricanes out the way. I'm hoping, these are kind of gone more or less. But send me comments, questions. I haven't really seen any yet from y'all's class yet. But remember, you get bonus points for commenting about my lectures, positive, negative, or asking me various historical questions. Whatever you want to ask me about history, I'll take any kind of question. But mostly about this period, I guess, is important. But send me stuff like that because you do get bonus points, of course, for that. So that's it for today. I'll have, of course, another lecture on Friday, which I'll, of course, wrap up Mesopotamia. And, of course, after that, I'm going to also lecture about, of course, ancient Egypt. So that's it for today. Hope y'all are doing fine out there, and take care. So I'll see y'all later.